Why did you use so many filters that you now look like a cartoon character? A, because I'm ugly, and B, because I like looking like a cartoon. Enjoy the show. Hello, Smarties! Welcome back. Today we are going to review another Dorian Gray movie from 1970. This one is called The Secret of Dorian Gray. Apparently it also has several alternate titles. Dorian Gray, The Secret of Dorian Gray, The God Called Dorian Gray, and The Sins of Dorian Gray, which is also the title of the 1983 movie. I also have a review of that. I couldn't find a copyright date at the start or the end of the movie when I watched it on Prime Video, but according to IMDb, it was released in August of 1970 in Italy and then several months later in the US. It opens with an argument, presumably between Basil and Dorian, and then it shows you a still frame of Dorian being angry, and suddenly there's this music sting that sounds like you're about to watch a horror movie. Granted, you could say that there are aspects of horror in the story, but then the music changes drastically, and it started to remind me of the soundtrack for the 1983 movie. There's this gentle piano music, and I'm like, did we just fall in love?
Huh?
At the end of the opening credits, this text came across the screen that kind of confused me. It said, an allegory based on the work of Oscar Wilde. What? The Dorian Gray story is already a symbolic story, so it's an allegory of an allegory? After the credits, Dorian wanders around his mansion that's almost tasteful but mostly gaudy, and he throws a jacket into the fireplace. And then we see random black cat face! Then Dorian is out at a bar with two guys. They're a little amused, but mostly bored when a guy in a sequin dress gets up and basically just runs across back and forth on the bar. When they leave, Dorian goes into a theater even though it's after hours, and he flirts with the actress Sybil Vane, who is in there practicing Romeo and Juliet by herself. Then they go out together and they get giggly looking at ducks. You know, as you do on a date, giggling at ducks. Then they go back to the theater, and they study while they play a cassette tape of the Romeo and Juliet dialogue. Later, Sybil is like, oh, I'm so glad I let you take my virginity because you're so hot. And Dorian is like, yeah, me too, girl. He's such a jerk. I'd like to address the fact that half of my chin disappeared thanks to the filters that I used. That is a noob vlogger mistake, and I am sorry. Dorian poses for Basil's painting, and he's trying to tell Basil how divine Sybil is, and Basil is like, boy, you trippin', and Dorian is like, nuh-uh, I'm being for real. And then Henry Wotton and his sister Gwendolyn, who is not in the book, show up and are enamored immediately by Basil's painting. Y'all, you have to see the portrait that Basil is painting of Dorian, okay? Dorian is in blue jeans, no shirt, and a little tie. Now, ladies, we like this, okay? Ain't nothing wrong with that. But what I'm saying is, dude, it looked like a Keith Urban album cover, okay? Like, he even had like a little bit of the blonde hair in the face. He looked like he was about to sing some Australian country songs, you know what I'm saying? Anyway, Gwendolyn is staring at Dorian, who's washing himself off outside.
Wow.
She's all like, ooh, look at him being all skinny and using that hose. As if to remind us that they're taking a good book and making this, they directly mention Oscar Wilde. Henry says, what is vice? Simply pleasure without shame. And Basil says, here we go, the epigrams of Oscar Wilde, badly edited by Henry Wotton. Both Henry and Gwendolyn immediately start to barrage Dorian with their cheap, sour views of life. Turning the Lord Henry character into two people didn't really seem necessary, but to be fair, when you have two bad influences in your life, sometimes that does take effect faster than if it's just one person, so it is kind of relatable. We quickly meet Sybil's brother James. They seem to have a happy relationship, but when we meet their mother, she doesn't seem to care at all about who Sybil is dating, as long as he's got money, and that is true to the book. Dorian and Sybil go visit a dirty castle that belongs to Dorian's family. He shows her a fancy chaise lounge, and Sybil freaks out like, oh, you've had girls here before. And he's like, no, girl. Sybil runs outside all upset, and Dorian catches her and they, study by a tree. Dorian meets Henry again, who says, basically, who cares what the meaning of life is? You're only gonna be young once, enjoy it, because pretty soon you're gonna be old and nasty. Dorian sees Basil's finished portrait of him, and immediately is like, oh my gosh, I look like Keith Urban. And he makes the wish about giving his soul to look young forever. There's a weird argument here between Basil and Dorian, and Basil is like, you need to stop freaking out because you're being kind of creepy. I'm gonna go ahead and destroy the portrait. And Dorian is like, no, man, it's like a part of me. I don't know what part, but it's a part of me. And I was thinking, Maybe it's the groin, because you were acting like a little Sybil and Dorian drive to a bridge to wave to her brother James as he's sailing away. I don't think we're told where he's going. There's a long creepy moment where James is staring at Dorian on the bridge. At a party, there's some pretty decent attempt at social commentary. Dorian seems to hook up with Gwendolyn. There's a shot of rich people filling up their plates with way too much food, kind of exemplifying their decadence and their overabundance and hedonism, which is true to the vibe in the book, and there's some conversation about how war makes people money. Dorian brings some acquaintances to see Sybil acting on a stage, and she's absolutely horrible. Even her co-star looks at her like, "What? Girl, what you doing though?" We see Dorian getting more upset as the play goes on. When Dorian and Sybil leave, she laughs and says, "When I saw you with those carnivorous women, the theater died to me." And he gets really mad and embarrassed. Sybil says, "Go back to your old woman, she can give you something that I can't." Dorian admits that the older woman he was out with offered him $500,000, but we're not exactly told for what, which I found kind of classy. Sybil says, "Oh, I thought your body would be worth more than that," and Dorian slaps her, and he runs away. Then Sybil deliberately runs into traffic. It was sad. Dorian and Gwendolyn Watton hook up again. There's some interesting cinematography in this scene where you see the side of the bed and then two hands touching are slowly revealed. And that made me think about how often Oscar Wilde described a physical feature that I guess he found attractive. He constantly said, "white hands." When Dorian gets home, his portrait looks really grumpy. He freaks out and covers it with a tablecloth. He asks a scientist acquaintance, Alan Campbell, if there's something wrong with the paint, but it seems fine. Dorian sends an apology to Sybil Vane's address. Henry visits to show Dorian the newspaper article about Sybil's passing. Dorian gets upset here, but he sounds really selfish and more irritated than sad, just like he was in the book. He says, "How could she do this to me?" You can tell that Henry's ideas are already corrupting his attitude. Henry says Dorian's lucky that Sybil billed herself, because Henry's ex-lovers all had the audacity to keep living and constantly beg him for attention. The older rich lady shows Dorian around her stables, and they go into an empty stall together, and she gives Dorian a check. Y'all, the look on her face, she gasps like, "Oh, he touched my fruitcake." When he gets home, Dorian's portrait looks more wrinkled and has arthritic hands. Dorian is on a yacht with fancy yacht people. Gwendolyn looks jealous when he's kissing another lady. Then when they pass each other in the hall, Gwendolyn grabs him, pulls him into a private room, and then there's this really tasteful thing where the door closes and then all of a sudden it opens again and they have their clothes on, and I thought that was really classy. Well, Dorian steps out of the room and the lady that he was kissing before is waiting. Hello. And he shoves her into the room with Gwendolyn and they start kissing. It's sort of a nod to how the book mentions that Basil wishes that Dorian would use his influence on people for good instead of bad. I mean, he literally in this movie physically pushes somebody into a choice that they might not have even been thinking about before, and they might regret later. And causing someone to have a regret is probably one of the worst things you can cause them. Now, we are talking about adults here who are making their own decisions, so I know Dorian isn't the only one to blame. Through some kind of clever camera moves and mirrors and other special effects, Dorian is shown hooking up with some men and some women without showing any nudity, which I thought was very classy, and kind of wasting his time in frivolous activities. I think this is also a good nod to the book, because the reason that Dorian's portrait gets so disfigured, I mean, it's not just normal aging. I think it's heavily implied that Dorian probably caught a couple diseases, but of course it got passed on to his painting. So I mean, that's sad, but what's even sadder is that since Dorian couldn't get sick, he was just passing on these diseases from men to women and then back again. Also, in this movie, it is implied that Dorian probably took advantage of someone underage, which is pretty depressing. At a party, Dorian is staring at Alan Campbell's wife. Another lady notices this, and when Dorian gets Mrs. Campbell into a private room, the lady locks the door and then starts taking pictures of them through a window. Remember this part. Dorian basically insinuates that he's going to force himself on Mrs. Campbell, which was really creepy. And Mrs. Campbell then sees him naked, and I guess she's like, "Oh, look at him being all skinny and skinny-like. Well, I guess okay then." Dorian thinks he sees Sybil Vane at another party, but it's a lady named Gladys, the wife of a doctor friend of Basil's. Random black cat face again! Basil sees Dorian is way too entranced with Gladys, and so when he's back at Dorian's place, he says, "Please, keep it in your pants sometimes, bruh. Please don't ruin the nice marriage of my friends." And Dorian says, "I hate lectures. You know what? This is all your fault anyway. Let me show you something." And he shows Basil the portrait, which now looks about 75 years old, even though Dorian is probably only about 40, which proves that he's been putting a lot of nasty junk on that poor portrait. Dorian gets mad when Basil starts praying. This brings us back to the opening scene where Dorian murders Basil, and then his painting has blood on its hands. Dorian runs off to a club. 70s pop music is very 70s. From the club, Dorian calls Alan Campbell, who has aged, which we know because they have colored his hair with what looks like white spray paint. Dorian tells him to come over. Alan says, "Is it really important?" Dorian's like, "Very important." Alan is like, "All right then, I'll come over." I found this kind of unexpected because in the movie we've only seen them meet each other a couple of times, and I don't know why Alan feels like he owes Dorian anything. In the book it's implied that Dorian knows about some illegal things that Alan might have done, and that's how he blackmails him into destroying the evidence. But in this story, the conversation felt unnatural and rushed. Before he leaves the very 70s club, a lady calls Dorian Sir Galahad, which was Sybil's nickname for him, whereas in the book his nickname is Prince Charming. James is at the club, he overhears the nickname, and he follows Dorian outside and threatens to shoot him. Now, he only seems to accuse Dorian of knowing Sybil. He doesn't actually mention, like, oh, you broke her heart, which caused her passing. And Dorian's like, no, I don't know anyone by that name. And he steps into this bright light, and James goes, okay, no, you're too young. You're right. Yeah, you probably aren't the same guy. And it's just weird that the only accusation is you knew my sister. That's a weird reason to want to shoot somebody. So I don't think that the confrontation was handled well. Alan shows up at Dorian's place. Dorian admits that he billed Basil. Alan says, I'm not helping you with anything. Then Dorian shows him some pictures that were taken of him hooking up with Alan's wife. I guess Alan was embarrassed and didn't want to bear the shame if that tryst got out in public, so he agrees to help him get rid of the evidence. Gladys, the lady who looks like Sybil, meets Dorian at a hunting trip. Dorian sees James Vane watching him from the forest. Honestly, this scene made me laugh and it shouldn't have, but I'm sorry, we have close-up of Dorian, serious face, then James, serious face, then Dorian, then James. It was kind of cheesy. Just like in the book, somebody else accidentally shoots James, which is sad. Dorian freaks out at first, but then when he sees the body, he looks very relieved. Some of the changes in the movie did make sense, like they used certain creative visuals sometimes to show us the exhausting lifestyle of Dorian. One lazy change that the movie made was the insinuation that Henry hooks up with Dorian. In the book, it's clear that Henry really gets his kicks from watching other people's lives as opposed to participating. It even says near the end of the book that he doesn't believe Dorian could be guilty of anything wretched. So it's pretty clear he never really got that close to knowing Dorian. I think Henry kind of lived outside of that bubble. I understand having his sister Gwendolyn hook up with Dorian because it's heavily implied that Lord Henry is attracted to him. Wow. But the movie sort of took a cheap shot at Henry by going all the way because he was more the type to live vicariously. Henry and Dorian are hanging out and Henry basically asks, how did you stay so young looking? He says, tell me, Dorian, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and to lose his soul? Now, out of everyone that might have quoted this verse, I never would have expected it from Henry. I mean, he's the kind of guy who would have a smarty pants answer to it, but I don't think he ever would have been the one asking the question. Henry makes a relatable observation here, which, yes, he also sometimes does that in the book, even though it is just pseudo-psychology, you know, it's just his opinions. He's still kind of right. He does notice that it's frightening to feel so young while looking so old, and realizing that your body is decaying. And yes, some of my patients have struggled with that because society makes them feel like they're not important because they're older, okay? But there's this depth, there's this beauty in them. They're pretty on the inside while their outside is changing. They're pretty people on the inside because they're older. So it really can be exhausting to be in a world that's filled with these Lord Henrys who value appearance over wisdom. At a bar, Dorian's hands are shaking while he sees the TV news talk about Alan Campbell, who has been found not alive. Dorian's portrait now looks hella old. I mean, like chewed leather. While he looks at it, he has flashes of the people that he's hurt over time, and he stabs the painting and falls down. The camera pans back and we see a quote put up from the book that explains how he was only recognizable based on the jewelry on his hands. Overall, it was a much closer adaptation of the book than the 1945, the 1973, and the 1982 versions. I haven't seen other adaptations other than those four, but I have been looking for them. I feel like this movie missed an opportunity that it literally set up for itself by splitting the Lord Henry character into like two people by having Henry and Gwendolyn kind of henpeck Dorian's very weak constitution. They could have shown both sides of the dual nature, basically, of Henry from the book. Henry spends a lot of time with Dorian, but he's just the type of guy to watch people get stuck in their own webs, not to get stuck in it with them. He is fascinated by Dorian, so it makes sense for like one side of him to think about the hookup, so maybe that could be represented by Gwendolyn, while the other side of him, where he kind of wants to stay away and just be an observer, could have been represented by Henry himself in the movie. By having them all have an affair, they really missed the opportunity to show that dual nature of Harry, and it seemed lazy to me. They matched the actor closer to the appearance of Dorian than in other movies I've seen. Helmut Berger did look like a guy that you'd go, okay, I can kind of see the appeal, which, yeah, that made me feel kind of shallow. But I love how even though he was good looking, as soon as he started to make deliberately bad choices and treat people badly, you did not like the character. He just seemed like a shallow vessel that was seeking his selfish desires, just like in the book. They also show him wrestle briefly with guilt about Sybil, but not enough to try to change, and that was also true to the original. And Basil I really liked. Now in the book he's a little more meek, a little more quiet. I think he is the character you're supposed to like the most, and yes, okay, I fell for it. I did like him the most in the book as well. And the actor Richard Todd, he actually plays him quite differently in the movie. He's a little more brash, he's a little more blunt, he's got kind of a stiffer backbone, he's willing to speak his mind a little better. And even though he's that different, Basil still ended up being my favorite character in the movie. Some goofy things stood out to me, of course, like the production value was okay for the most part, but the 70s fashion and 70s music soundtrack did make me giggle a little bit. And the dialogue felt like this weird mix between modern and the Oscar Wilde version, because you've got some people sort of waxing eloquent in sort of an Oscar Wilde style, quoting from the book, and then they would go back to the 70s lingo. In this movie, some of the lessons from the novel get to shine. We need to be nicer to everybody, stop being selfish in your private life and your public life, and be more honest. To me, it felt like the movie was made by someone who appreciated the novel and was just trying to update it a little bit for that time. Thank you for watching again, and remember, compassion is love plus action. If you enjoyed this, please also check out the Drunken Fish Writers Group podcast, and have a great day. I survived. Who? Sybil? Okay. Sybil. Do you like that? Yeah. I like you.
Oh, thank you so much.